So this is about the study that presents the benefits of intergroup relational identity for organizations. And the questions that they asked in the study were, will a leader's promotion of intergroup relational identity increase psychological safety and trust in the leader? And then, does promoting intergroup relational identity indirectly affect organizational citizenship behavior, both individually and towards the organization? And this study comes out of social identity theory, and within this you have these ideas of intergroup relational identity and also collective identity. And what intergroup relational identity is it's this, and I think we've talked about this in studies before here, but intergroup relational identity allows group members to retain the individual distinctiveness of their group identity while working together with another group on something else. So it's both recognizing the differences between the groups, but then also and holding space for that, but then also still being able to work together and the ability to actually do that. Whereas collective identity is this idea that we should ignore all of our differences, only focus on our similarities, and that's what's going to help us work together better. So that's kind of the dichotomy, I think, that this study takes. And the methods that the researcher used was he had these 274 undergraduate students at a Canadian university participate in this experimental design. The participants were asked to imagine that they had to work with students of a competing university and were randomly assigned to one of the two vignettes that a leader in their group would read. And so they're split up into these two groups, one representing intergroup relational identity, one representing collective identity. And the intergroup relational identity leader asked participants to work together while retaining the distinctiveness of their group identities. And then the collective identity leader asked participants to ignore their differences ignore the differences and think of themselves as a collective team. And then after they went through this, the students were asked with producing a report on each school's advantages and disadvantages, which was supposed to be a guide for high school graduates. And then they filled out a questionnaire on measures like intergroup relational identity, psychological safety, trust in leader, organizational citizenship behavior, knowledge sharing intention, and then conflict level. And actually, I can pull up these. I brought up the vignettes. So these are the vignettes that they used specifically within the intergroup relational identity condition. It is important that students from both universities recognize the unique and valued contributions each one can provide to the team. Students should not ignore important differences between Western University and Queen's University and pretend both schools are the same. In fact, it is essential that students from both universities realize that this collaboration will only excel if individuals recognize the distinct and unique roles that students from both universities possess. And then the collective identity is, it is important that students from both universities recognize your similarities and work together as members of this collaborative team. I believe you are part of a single collective team, and ignoring your differences is essential to your success. In fact, it is essential that students from both universities realize that this collaboration will only excel if individuals recognize they have a common identity as a member of this team, no matter what university to which they belong. Those are the vignettes that the leaders read to the participants. And the results here were that intergroup relational identity specifically was positively associated with organizational citizenship behavior. And the results showed that when an intergroup relational identity was promoted, participants showed stronger intentions of behaving in ways that would benefit the entire group. However, it was interesting, the rhetorical approach of the leader, the collective versus intergroup relational, did not influence the hypothesized mediators of psychological safety or the trust in leader. But the author did conduct a path analysis which suggested that trust played a central role in these interactions. And so he essentially found that the perception, when students viewed the perception of leaders' efforts to form an intergroup relational identity, they were more likely to engage in positive intergroup behaviors, which seemed to result, at least in partly, due to trust in leader. And he kind of equated this to this principle of reciprocity, that when students would hear the leader make an effort to establish an intergroup relational identity, they wanted to reciprocate that behavior and engage in this positive intergroup behavior. And so I think this is a pretty interesting study just on how to manage intergroup conflict when you have two groups working together. And a key takeaway I think that we can bring from this for both consultants and everyone, for consultants, that in situations where tensions between two groups are high, promoting this intergroup relational identity could be a helpful avenue for positive intergroup behavior. And for everyone, being able to hold the distinctiveness of your own group identity in one hand and hold a shared identity with others in another may be helpful for greater collaboration when you're working with people of different groups. So that's what we have for this one.
This is a great study. I mean, I think this really speaks a lot to the intergroup contact field, and there's some other research that kind of suggests similar things, which is basically that you can't just ignore differences, you have to acknowledge them and simultaneously create, some sort of superordinate identity or some sort of commonality. So those things become, because if you skip one or the other, it feels dismissive. So yeah, this is a good support for the fact that we need to identify that, yes, you are different and unique, and that's very important, and we're also similar, not one of the other.
Yeah, agreed. I think as this is illustrating, it's important to do both, and also be mindful of what differences you're acknowledging and what similarities you're talking about, right? I feel like there has to be a healthy, not necessarily like a balance, but a mindfulness in which ones which differences you're acknowledging, if that makes sense.
It might be important to, I would think it would be important to gauge what differences would be important to someone to acknowledge. So in other words, let's not assume that your school identity is important for us to acknowledge. Maybe you don't give a crap about being part of the school, but we should ask. And if that's important to you, then that should be an important thing to acknowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about a conversation I was having. We're having a conversation with a couple of folks on the sort of race relations and interracial relations, and one Black lady said, she doesn't necessarily, like, she's married to a white man and they have kids, and it's like she doesn't identify as this or that, and she doesn't really need to be acknowledged that way, and she doesn't really, it's not something that she thinks about, and when she thinks about it, it makes it worse. And she's like, I just want to be treated like a human being. That's her. And then there's another person that says, well, yeah, but I've been through things because of my race, and that is important for me to be acknowledged in that. So okay, well, let's gauge what's important for each person and not just assume that's something. Because if you start pointing something out that you think should be important to someone, and they're like, that's not important, why are you pointing that out? Then it could be even offensive in that way.
It's funny, I was listening to a sociologist, I can't remember the gentleman's name, yesterday on the radio, and they were going through, it was largely talking about like the census and what the results have been from that, and just how demographics in the United States are changing astronomically. And this sociologist was definitely older in age, and kind of talking about the past few decades and what he has experienced in his field and what he has seen change. But long story short, to kind of align with what you're saying, Jeremy, it was basically talking about this idea that, and they didn't have an answer, but that we need to kind of almost come up with new language when it comes to acknowledging these differences, especially regarding race, because of the fact that our population demographics are changing so much to where we can't keep having this binary, like white or everyone else is non-white. Yeah. So it's people of color or white, when there's so many kind of biracial or multiracial families nowadays, that so many people are feeling not misrepresented or underrepresented, especially in like when you have to check the boxes on papers and all that.
Yeah, I mean, even people that like, who's to say what you're supposed to identify as? even people that you would look at and go, oh, you're black or you're white or you're this or you're that. And then you ask them and they're just like, I don't identify that. If I check the box, that's not how I would check it. You know, it's like, so what matters more, how people are perceived by others or how they actually identify, you know, intrinsically?
And how do we like, I feel like it's going to be a long time in the making for figuring out what the best way to do this is, especially on the national level where like census bureaus, you know, where they're trying to, or any type of like legal documentation where they're asking you that. I don't know, maybe we can just get away with it and not have it. I don't know, but
what would be the point of it, I guess, you know?
Yeah.
But I work with this, I think I was telling you, I was consulting this company, like their mission is to get the word human being as one of the options on all demographic things. So if you don't want to identify as one of these races, you just want to identify as a human, you're allowed to do it. You know? Just like, yeah, that's a good aspiration.
I think that's really fascinating though. And I like that because it actually brings up conversations my husband and I had, because my son is blonde hair, very light eyes, very pale skin, but he's actually also Hispanic and he doesn't look Hispanic at all. And so we've often talked about that as he grows up, people might assume that he's not because he doesn't look like it whatsoever, but he is. And we don't know, you know, how much he'll identify with that, but he might, you know, identify as biracial. And it's, you know, so it's interesting. I think that's a fascinating conversation. And I like that it's trending in that direction of how do we want to categorize that moving forward?
Yeah, I think I feel like we're all speaking to there's a danger to making too many assumptions about where people are at and what they identify with. Because
it's like,
yeah,
we're trying, you know, I think we're trying to get to the place where we're all on the same team, because that would help really mitigate conflict in general. Hey, we're all on the same team here, even though we have like little conflicts here and there, but we're all on the same team. And like the movement of like, hey, let's all identify as human beings, right? As a primary, and then we can all talk about the different subgroups of that. You know, but really at the bottom line, we're on the same human team. Mm-hmm. That's important, but it's hard. I think it's hard to get there if we just skip over identifying the groups that are important to us, right? It's like, well, let's not talk about your group. Let's not talk about your race or your religion or anything like that. Like, we're all human. We just skip over that stuff. I think people will be like, no, but that's important to me. You know, that's my culture, my heritage, my history, my beliefs. Those are important to me, and those are not the same as everyone else's. So I think they need.
Yeah, that's the collective versus intergroup relational identity there, right there. Yeah. You know?
I would be interested to see another study that adds the third dimension of individuality, of saying, so you have those same vignettes, but you don't focus on only the group. You also focus on the individual. Like, how important is it for you to be identified as an individual? Because there's a theory called optimal distinctiveness theory, which is very similar to what they're kind of talking about here, and it's the difference between individual identity and social identity, and how there's this sort of, the mind is constantly requiring this sort of balance between how much I feel important as an individual versus how much I like distinct from the group versus how much I feel as part of the group, one of the group members. And there's this constant balance. I think if you added that into this framework, I don't know what you'd call it, like you get intergroup relational identity, optimal distinctiveness, and then you added those two together, you have a multi-dimensional framework. Like, well, what's important? Is it important to have all dimensions? Is it super important to have, number one, your socio-cultural identity, number two, your individual identity, and number three, your shared common identity? All three together, is that like a great combination if we make all of those salient?
Because there are people who identify with groups but don't want to be lost necessarily in the overall assumptions that people make of that group. So I think that'd be fascinating too. We'll have to look if anyone has done anything like that, like a study like this, but just adding in that additional factor.
If you look for optimal distinctiveness theory and then you maybe search for intergroup relational, maybe there's something in there, because I know that they've done optimal distinctiveness at the group level where they're looking at it's very similar to what we're talking about. Your group being this distinct from other groups, but also somewhat have some commonalities to the group. And it seems like they're both talking about almost the same thing, just they have different names.
Yeah. We did a study in last year that looked at both intergroup relational identity, collective identity. Then they had a third option of dual group identity, which is it says you're retaining individual group identities while imposing a common group everyone is a part of, which sounds like intergroup relational identity, but they define intergroup relational identity here as focusing on promoting group identity differences, like promoting those differences as mutually beneficial and interdependent, which is a slight difference between that and dual group identity, which doesn't quite tap on what you're talking about here, but it would be interesting.